Morgan Freeman stops for a homeless man. What happens next leaves everyone in tears. The streets of New York City bustled with their usual energy. Taxis honked, hurried business people rushed past each other, and cafe patios were filled with conversations that no one outside their bubble cared to hear. It was just another day, another moment where people moved too fast to notice what was happening around them. Across the street from an upscale cafe, a man sat on the cold pavement, his back against a weathered brick wall. His clothes were worn, his hands rough and calloused, and a battered paperback rested on his lap. He wasn't panhandling. He wasn't calling for attention. He was simply there. Do we judge too quickly without knowing the full story? Comment 1 for yes, 0 for no. People passed by without a glance. To them, he was invisible, but not to Morgan Freeman. The Hollywood legend had just stepped out of the cafe, casually dressed, enjoying his morning coffee, when he noticed the man across the street. Something about him, the way he was hunched over his book, the way he seemed lost in thought despite the chaos around him, made Morgan pause. Most people walked past because they assumed they already knew his story. Morgan, he wanted to hear it. With his coffee in one hand, he crossed the street and stopped in front of the man. "That's a great book," Morgan said, nodding toward the tattered copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. The man looked up, startled. His eyes, tired but intelligent, flickered with surprise. "Yeah," he said cautiously. "I used to teach it." Morgan raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" The man nodded. 12 years. I taught history and literature, but life has a way of flipping things upside down." Morgan Freeman studied him for a long moment before speaking. "And how exactly did a teacher end up here?" The man exhaled, gripping the book a little tighter. "I lost everything." Morgan Freeman didn't move. The weight of those words hung in the air. And in that moment, he made a decision, one that would change both of their lives forever. Morgan Freeman thought he was just stopping for a quick conversation. But within moments, he would find himself rewriting the future of a man the world had already given up on. Morgan Freeman stood still, his coffee cooling in his hand, as he took in the sight of the man before him. Daniel Carter, once a history and literature teacher, now just another forgotten face on the streets of New York. For years, Daniel had spent his days standing in front of classrooms, inspiring students with stories of the past, teaching them how words could change the world. But now no one even looked at him. People hurried past, too caught up in their own lives to notice a man whose life had been unraveled by circumstances beyond his control. Morgan wasn't like them. He wanted to hear Daniel's story. Morgan crouched down, meeting Daniel's gaze at eye level, making it clear that he wasn't there out of pity, but out of respect. 12 years of teaching, huh? Morgan said, nodding toward the book in Daniel's hands. "That's no small thing." Daniel chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "Yeah," he murmured, 12 years shaping young minds, and now here I am, just another statistic." Morgan raised an eyebrow. "Statistics don't read To Kill a Mockingbird on a cold sidewalk," he pointed out. Daniel let out a slow breath. "I used to tell my students that knowledge is power," he said. "That history matters. That literature teaches us who we are." He glanced down at his torn jacket, the frayed edges of his sleeves. "Turns out none of that protects you when life decides to turn on you." Morgan felt something stir inside him. He had met many people throughout his life, some powerful, some brilliant, some lost. But Daniel? Daniel still had fire in him, and yet the world had let him slip through the cracks. "How long have you been out here?" Morgan asked. Daniel hesitated as if trying to count the days. "Too long," he finally said. "First, I lost my job. Then the medical bills started piling up. A month turned into 6, then a year. After that, you stopped keeping track." Morgan nodded, absorbing every word. "And no one helped?" Daniel let out a bitter laugh. "Help?" he repeated. "You know, when I first lost my home, I thought the hardest part would be the cold. Or the hunger, but it's neither." Morgan waited. "It's the invisibility," Daniel said softly. "It's watching people pretend you don't exist. It's knowing that to them you're not a person anymore, just part of the scenery. Morgan felt a slow, simmering anger rise in him. How many people had walked past Daniel today alone? 100? 1,000? How many had seen the book in his hands and not even considered for a moment that he might be someone worth talking to? And yet, here you are, Morgan said, still reading, still thinking, still fighting to hold on to the man you were. Daniel looked at him for a long moment. Yeah, he admitted, but I don't know how much longer I can fight. Morgan exhaled slowly. That was all he needed to hear, because he wasn't about to let Daniel fight alone. Morgan glanced around, taking in the indifference of the people passing by. They didn't see Daniel, but soon they would. Standing up, Morgan extended a hand. Come on, he said. Daniel frowned. Where? Somewhere warm, Morgan replied. Somewhere where people remember that you exist. Daniel hesitated. This was a man he had only just met, but something in Morgan's eyes told him this wasn't just another passerby. This was someone who truly cared. Slowly, Daniel took the offered hand, and for the first time in months, he felt something he had thought was lost forever. Hope. Daniel had spent years feeling invisible, but in just a few moments, he was about to realize that the right person noticing you can change everything. Morgan Freeman walked beside Daniel Carter, moving away from the cold sidewalk where he had spent the past few nights. Despite the chill in the air, there was a shift, an unspoken understanding that something was about to change. Daniel wasn't sure where they were going, and for a moment, a flicker of doubt crept into his mind. He had been let down before. People had made promises, small gestures of kindness that never lasted. But something about Morgan Freeman was different. Not just because he was famous, not just because his voice could command a room, but because for the first time in a long time, someone had truly seen him. As they approached a quiet, upscale restaurant, Daniel slowed his pace. I don't belong in there, he muttered, shaking his head. Morgan stopped beside him, studying his face. And why is that? He asked simply. Daniel looked down at his clothes, the worn-out jacket, the tattered jeans, the boots that had seen too many winters. Because people like me don't get invited inside places like that, he admitted. Morgan smiled knowingly. Then it's about time we change that, don't you think? Without waiting for a response, Morgan held open the door, stepping inside like it was the most natural thing in the world. After a brief hesitation, Daniel followed. The moment they entered, the shift was immediate. Conversation slowed, eyes darted toward them. Servers and guests alike exchanged glances, their curiosity quickly giving way to something else. Judgment. Daniel had felt this before, that weight of being out of place. The way people subtly turned away, the way they suddenly became very interested in their meals, as if ignoring him would make him disappear. But Morgan Freeman, he didn't flinch. He walked to the host's stand with the same confidence he always carried, as if bringing Daniel in was the most normal thing in the world. Table for two, please, he said, flashing his signature warm smile. The host, a young man in a neatly pressed suit, hesitated. His gaze flickered toward Daniel, then back to Morgan, and for a moment, it looked like he might refuse. Then recognition dawned. Morgan Freeman, a legend. Someone who didn't just request things, he made things happen. The host quickly regained his composure, nodding as he grabbed two menus. Right this way, Mr. Freeman. Daniel followed, his steps careful, as if any wrong move might get him thrown out. He was about to learn that tonight things would be different. As they settled into a corner booth, a waitress approached, pen poised over her notepad. Her eyes darted toward Daniel, hesitant, uncertain. Morgan noticed. Two of the house specials, he said smoothly, handing over the menus without looking at them. The waitress hesitated, then nodded. Of course, and to drink? Morgan turned to Daniel. What'll it be? Daniel blinked, caught off guard. Just water is fine. Morgan smirked. And a coffee for him, black. Daniel stared at him. How did you... A man who carries To Kill a Mockingbird on the street probably isn't the type to settle for just water, Morgan said with a wink. Daniel let out a small, startled laugh. It was the first real laugh he had allowed himself in months, and just like that, the weight in his chest felt a little lighter. As they waited for their meals, Morgan leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "Tell me, Daniel," he said. "What happened?" Daniel sighed, looking down at his hands. "Where do I start?" "Start where it all changed." Daniel took a deep breath. "I had a job, a home, a life that made sense. I taught history, and I loved it. Then my mother got sick, really sick. I drained my savings trying to pay her medical bills, and when she passed, I couldn't keep up with rent. Lost the apartment, lost my car, lost everything." Morgan listened, not interrupting, not offering empty reassurances. "I tried getting another job, but once you've been out of work too long, people don't want to take a chance on you. They see gap in employment and assume the worst." Daniel swallowed hard, his voice wavering for the first time. "It's funny, isn't it? I used to teach students about history's greatest thinkers, about how society progresses, about empathy. But the moment I needed someone to show me that same empathy, no one did." Morgan exhaled slowly. "That's not funny," he said. "That's tragic." Daniel nodded. "Yeah, but at some point you stop being surprised." Morgan studied him for a long moment. "No one should ever get used to being invisible." The words hung between them, carrying more weight than anything Daniel had heard in a long time. And for the first time, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, his story wasn't over yet. Their meals arrived, hot and steaming, the kind of food Daniel hadn't tasted in what felt like an eternity. For the first few minutes, he ate in silence, savoring every bite. Morgan led him. He knew that sometimes kindness wasn't just in words, it was in letting someone feel human again. Finally, Daniel set his fork down, exhaling deeply. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, looking at Morgan with genuine curiosity. Morgan leaned back, folding his arms. "Because I can." Daniel scoffed. "That's it?" Morgan smiled. "Because I can," he repeated, "and because I should." Daniel sat back, letting those words settle in. For so long, he had believed that the world had turned its back on him. But maybe, just maybe, there were still people willing to turn around. As they finished their meal, Morgan pulled out his phone, tapping a number. "Lisa?" "Yeah, it's me. I've got someone I need you to meet." Daniel frowned. "Who's Lisa?" Morgan smiled. "She runs a program that helps get people back on their feet. Jobs, housing, the whole thing." Daniel stared at him. "You're serious?" "Dead serious." Daniel shook his head, struggling to process it. "Why would you do that for me?" Morgan chuckled. "Because if the world is going to pretend you don't exist, then it's about time someone reminded them that you do." Daniel had spent years believing his story was over, but tonight he learned that sometimes all it takes is one person who refuses to look away. The warmth of the restaurant contrasted starkly with the cold streets outside, but for Daniel, the real shift wasn't just in temperature, it was in his understanding of what was happening. For the first time in years, someone wasn't just offering him loose change, an empty apology, or a passing glance of pity. Morgan Freeman was offering him a way back, but was Daniel ready to take it? As Morgan Freeman set his phone down after speaking with Lisa, the woman who could change everything, Daniel stared at him, his mind caught in a whirlpool of doubt. "You're serious about this?" Daniel asked cautiously, his fingers tightening around the warm coffee cup in front of him. Morgan nodded, his expression unwavering. "You've got a chance to get back on your feet," he said simply. "I don't think you're the kind of man who lets chances like that slip away." Daniel let out a slow breath, looking down at his worn hands, hands that once flipped through textbooks, wrote lesson plans, graded papers, hands that once shaped young minds. Now they were rough from cold nights and holding on to nothing. "I don't know if I can do it," Daniel admitted, his voice quieter than before. Morgan tilted his head slightly. "Why not?" Daniel let out a dry chuckle. "Because I don't know if I remember how to be that man anymore." Morgan took a sip of his coffee, letting the words settle between them. "That man never left," he finally said. "You just stopped believing he still existed." Daniel exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You make it sound so simple. It is, Morgan replied. The world makes things complicated. But at the core, change is a choice. And right now, you're standing at a crossroads. Daniel swallowed hard because he could feel it too. This was it. This was the moment. Morgan stood up, tossing a few bills onto the table to cover their meal. Come on, he said. Daniel hesitated. Where are we going? To meet someone who can help you, Morgan replied as if it were the simplest thing in the world. Daniel's heart pounded. Everything in him wanted to trust this, to believe that this wasn't just another false promise, but hope had burned him before. And yet, this was Morgan Freeman. With a deep breath, Daniel rose from his seat, and for the first time in a long time, he took a step toward something more. Lisa's office wasn't far, a small but well-run facility dedicated to helping people like Daniel find their way back into society. When they arrived, Lisa was already waiting. Morgan told me about you, she said warmly, extending her hand. I run a program that helps people rebuild. That means housing, job placement, counseling, whatever it takes. Daniel shook her hand cautiously. What's the catch? He asked, still expecting the other shoe to drop. Lisa smiled. No catch, she said, just commitment. We can open the door, but you have to be the one to walk through it. Daniel glanced at Morgan. And you trust her? He asked. Morgan chuckled. If I didn't, we wouldn't be standing here. Lisa folded her arms. So, what do you say, Daniel? You ready to start over? Daniel felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just a meal. This wasn't just a warm conversation. This was a door out of the life he had been trapped in for years. And the question was, did he have the courage to walk through it? Daniel's throat was dry. How many times had he dreamed of something like this? Of someone reaching out, offering more than just a temporary fix? He had spent years believing no one cared. But Morgan Freeman had proven him wrong. Lisa was proving him wrong. And maybe, just maybe, it was time he stopped proving himself wrong. With a deep breath, he nodded. Okay, he said. Let's do this. Lisa smiled. Morgan? He just gave a slow, approving nod, because he already knew. Daniel was finally on his way back. Daniel had spent years convinced the world had forgotten him. But tonight he learned the truth. Sometimes all it takes is one person who refuses to look away. The decision had been made. Daniel Carter had spent years believing there was no way out, that once you fell through the cracks of society, there was no climbing back. But now? Now he was standing at the threshold of change. The question was, could he really do this? As Lisa led Daniel through the facility, explaining the details of the program, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Fear, not fear of rejection, not fear of sleeping on the streets another night, but fear of what happened if he failed. Morgan Freeman, sensing the hesitation, fell into step beside him. You look like a man carrying a million thoughts right now, he observed. Daniel let out a dry laugh. You have no idea. Try me, Morgan said, giving him a knowing look. Daniel hesitated, then sighed. What if I can't do this? He admitted. What if I go through all of this, and I still end up back where I started? Morgan stopped walking. Daniel followed suit, confused. Morgan turned to face him, his expression thoughtful. Let me ask you something, he said. Do you remember the first book you ever read that really changed you? Daniel frowned, not expecting the question. Yeah, he said after a beat. It was Of Mice and Men. I was 13. Morgan nodded. And before that? Did you ever doubt you could get through a book that big? Daniel let out a soft chuckle. I did. Thought it was way over my head. But you finished it? Yeah, Morgan smiled. See, that's life. You start something, and sometimes it feels too big, too much. But one page at a time, one day at a time, you get through it. Daniel swallowed hard, because he knew Morgan was right. This wasn't about being ready, it was about taking the first step. Lisa handed Daniel a set of keys. It's temporary housing, she explained, but it's yours while you get back on your feet. Daniel stared at the keys in his palm. For the first time in years, he had a place to sleep that wasn't a park bench or a shelter that kicked people out at sunrise. His fingers tightened around the metal. "This is real," he murmured. Lisa smiled. "Very real." Morgan placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "This is your first chapter," he said. "What you write next?" "That's up to you." Daniel exhaled, stepping into the room. It was small, just a bed, a nightstand, a bathroom. But to him, it was more than enough. It was a beginning. But just as quickly as hope filled his chest, a darker thought pushed its way in. What if this was temporary? What if something went wrong? What if after all of this, he still ended up back on the street? Daniel sat on the bed, staring at the floor, his mind spiraling. Morgan, still standing at the doorway, watched him for a moment before stepping inside. "You're waiting for something to go wrong, aren't you?" Daniel let out a sharp breath. "Yeah," he admitted. "I guess I am." Morgan pulled up a chair, settling in. "That's because for too long things always did." Daniel nodded. "Exactly. But that changes now," Morgan said, his voice steady. "The past doesn't get to decide your future unless you let it." Daniel looked up. "And what if I mess this up?" Morgan smiled. "Then you get back up, because the only way you truly fail is if you stop trying." The next morning, Daniel met Morgan outside the housing facility. "You're really still here?" Daniel asked, half joking. Morgan chuckled. "I don't make empty promises," he said. They walked in silence for a moment before Daniel spoke again. "I don't know how to thank you." Morgan shook his head. "You don't need to thank me." Daniel frowned. "Then what do I do?" Morgan stopped walking and turned to him. "One day," he said, "you're going to see someone who needs help. And when that day comes, you don't walk away. You do for them what someone did for you." Daniel took a deep breath, nodding. "I can do that." Morgan smiled. "Then that's all I need." Daniel had spent years believing the world had nothing left to offer him. But today, he learned that sometimes the best second chances come when you least expect them. Daniel stood at the entrance of the temporary housing facility, gripping the keys in his pocket as the morning sun cast long shadows across the pavement. Everything felt surreal. For the first time in years, he had slept in a real bed. Not on a bench, not in a shelter where he had to leave at sunrise, not in an alley where he had to keep one eye open for danger. A real bed, in a real room, with a real door that locked. But even as he stood there, feeling the warmth of the sunlight on his face, a small part of him still questioned whether this was real, whether this was just another fleeting moment of kindness that would fade, leaving him back where he started. Morgan Freeman saw the doubt in his eyes before Daniel could even speak it. "You think this is temporary," Morgan said, reading his thoughts as easily as a book. Daniel exhaled, nodding. "I've learned not to trust good things," he admitted. "They don't tend to last." Morgan chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Then maybe it's time to unlearn that," he said. "Because good things don't disappear when you stop expecting them to. They disappear when you stop believing you deserve them." Daniel looked away, letting those words sink in. For so long he had lived as if he didn't deserve another chance. But the truth, he did. And not because Morgan Freeman had said so, but because somewhere deep down he still wanted to believe it himself. As they walked toward a nearby cafe, Daniel turned to Morgan, his voice quieter now. "I don't know how to pay you back for this," he said. Morgan stopped, giving him a long, measured look before replying. "You don't," he said simply. Daniel frowned. "I don't?" Morgan smiled. "No," he said. "One day you're going to see someone who's stuck where you were. And when that happens, you help them. That's how you pay me back." Daniel swallowed hard. "You think I'll get to that point?" Morgan nodded. "I wouldn't have done this if I didn't." For the first time in a long time, Daniel felt something unfamiliar in his chest. Hope. Not borrowed, not given, not temporary, but real, growing inside him. He reached out, shaking Morgan's hand firmly. "Then I won't waste this," he promised. Morgan Freeman smiled. "Good," he said, "because the world doesn't need more people who've given up. It needs more people who remember what it's like to be seen. Through this story, we realize that kindness is not just a gesture. It's a force that can rewrite someone's future. Daniel believed his story was over, that no one cared, that second chances were a myth. But all it took was one person who refused to look away, one person who saw him not as a problem, but as a man who still had worth. Morgan Freeman didn't just give Daniel a place to sleep. He gave him something far more valuable, a reason to believe in himself again. Because at the end of the day, the greatest power we have is the power to remind someone that they matter.